I decided that I was going to break at least one rule this morning, at least one of my own rules anyway, which is I'm only using a single verse and not even the entire verse. I mean, Quakers aren't big on proof texting, but when I share the verse, I think you'll understand why. Psalm 30, verse 5, the second half, weeping may endure for the night, but joy cometh in the morning. All right, let's be honest. Show of hands, how many people have been finding joy a bit thin on the ground the last few years, if not especially the last 2? Yeah. When I was thinking about this, I mean, the first grain in the oyster was during my MAD project when I came across the first hymn that we sang this morning, and I couldn't shake it. And somebody who was sitting in this room, David Collins, said that he figured that was probably the seed of the message. And yeah, you were probably right about that.
I could just watch a message form. Sometimes we'll
And it doesn't. Yeah, and if you can't decide that I've elected myself Pope, then it's usually a message coming. Anyway. I'm going to take y'all back about 3 dozen years. 1986 was as lonesome as I have ever been. And in the spring, at the turn of spring in 1987, they had what used to be called the Distinguished Quaker Visitors Program at Guilford College. I don't know if they're still doing it or not. And it was 3 different women who had been in leadership positions, 2 of them in Quaker positions, one with FGC, one with FUM. And the third was the late Asia Bennett from AFSC. Well, and I've told the story about how I think her name was Marty Wallace or Walton from FGC, Friends General Conference. For those who have not yet mastered Quaker alphabet soup, was sharing the story about how she was in the middle of a move and she was feeling particularly overwhelmed. And so she went into meeting. And the message that she got, clearer than anything, I mean, it was almost instantaneous, as I remember her telling the story, was the message, go take a bath. And of course, being the good 5-year-old that she was, at least internally at this moment, she didn't. A bath was the last thing she wanted. I mean, the practical, grown-up woman side of her said, I don't have time for a bath. And so, like any good internal 5-year-old, she decides to pray to God as mother. And immediately she gets the image of this bathtub filled with steaming water, and she could see the steam rise. And it just looked and felt so inviting. So she went and got in and, took the word that she had been given. And her assessment was that she was probably better off for having done so. Well, I decided to try the same thing. The first time I don't remember getting anything. When I tried appealing to God as mother, I got this strange image. Do any of you remember the cover of Vogue that had Demi Moore heavily pregnant on it? Yeah, I got that sort of image several years before that. And had no idea what in the world to make of that. But while I was there, I ran into Ed Lowe, who at that time was the music department at Guilford. I mean, there were a couple of one-person departments on the faculty at Guilford. Ann Deegan was the classical languages and literature department, and Ed Lowe was the music department. And he told me about a friend of his on the faculty, because he knew I'd lived out in Kernersville, and he told me about a friend of his on the faculty who would soon be directing a play over my way. And I sort of filed that away. And at the end of, towards the end of April, I saw an advert in the Kernersville News, or as I sometimes refer to it, the Kernersville Gazette. About auditions for the upcoming Kernersville Little Theater production, which happened to be Fiddler on the Roof. And the faculty member was Joan Zubel. And so I figured, what can I lose? So I went, tried out, and got cast as Mordecai, whom my late cousin Joyce, on a number of occasions, because I don't know that Joyce ever said anything just the one time. She referred to Mordecai as the merriest innkeeper in all of Anatevka. And of course, I did the some of the mistakes you never do. I mean, at least for a while, and probably still, if anybody still has working VCRs and a copy of the tape that hasn't spoiled yet, in the middle of the build-up to the L'chaim to Life number, see, the scene is Tevye and Laser Wolf talking about Laser Wolf wanting to marry Tevye's oldest daughter. And I would go around with a bottle filled, of course, with water, and would pour it into various glasses around. And wherever I would come down to almost no water left in the bottle, I would just sort of shrug my shoulders. I'd look at it, sort of shrug my shoulders, and well, on this particular bit of film footage, it is me right between and upstaging Tevye and Laser Wolf, which you never do when you're on stage. And the way I got to know Joyce again was that I showed up for read-through in a t-shirt that I had at the time that I had gotten from a student group over at the University of York for their theatrical group, which was called The Lords of Misrule, and it was sort of like Carolina blue with a circle on it, and then a 13th century peasant doing a contretemps. So one leg out behind. And Joyce and one of her friends at the time saw it, and one says to the other, have you seen the guy with the 13th century peasant on him? And yes, the other had noticed, and so they came over, and that's how I was introduced to Joyce again, although I had met her very briefly back when I was in Guilford. And some other day I'll tell you that story, possibly. It was like, well, if you remember in the Gospel of Luke, after the devil tempts Jesus, he goes away again until an opportune time. So the ministry of Jesus is presented as being a special time. If you will, Judith, kairos time rather than chronos. Yeah, I thought I'd throw that in for your benefit.
You said hire us.
Kairos.
Kairos.
Well, when you aspirate that initial, it sometimes doesn't all come through. Joyce used to say that it was like 35 of us all fell in love with each other at the same time. I still have friends from that. And in the wedding scene, there's a part where Mordecai the innkeeper, who is also acting as MC, says, "Friends, let us not forget our dear departed, who lived and died in pain and poverty and hardship. But enough tears." I mean, yeah, it's over the top. But in a way, it's kind of analogous to where we are. We are all sick of wearing masks. We are all sick of distancing. Sometimes it looks as though there won't be an end to all of this, or at least, or any of it. We are sick and tired of licking our wounds from the people we've lost. We are sick and tired of dealing with the obfuscation of people who should know better, but won't do what's good for them. Because somebody they trusted, told them differently. And unfortunately, the person they chose to believe was a scoundrel, or misinformed, or whatever. For me, 1986 was followed by 1987. Some of the closest friendships I have ever had. I'm sure many of you have heard me say that if I had had my way in 1985 when my medieval studies course ended in England, I would probably have stayed if I had had the money. And I would have missed out on knowing my niece, my nephew, my great niece, and sometime or other make me show you the new pictures. And a number of the closest friendships I have, including some of you in this room, shows what I knew. IQ will only take you so far. And you've got to learn, as I am in the painful process of learning now. I don't know that you ever really get over a loss. It's sort of like a river that comes to an island. You just sort of live around it and go on. And you can't be like, well, in a fine example of mixing metaphors here, you can't be like Tennyson's Lady of Shalott, who, has this magic mirror that, because there's a curse on her if she goes down or looks at Camelot. And of course, Sir Lancelot comes riding by in her mirror one day, and she is utterly transfixed. She's been weaving this magic web against disaster. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. That's where Agatha Christie got that.
Yep.
She knows the curse has hit her. And she goes down and gets in a boat. She goes down to the river, finds a boat. She paints her name on it, gets in it, and lays down, floats all the way down to Camelot, by which point she's died of exposure. You can't be like that. In one of the Harry Potter books, Dumbledore tells Harry, I think it's actually the first one, Dumbledore tells Harry that he's glad to see that Harry has been focusing on what's important. You can't live in dreams. You can be guided by dreams, but you can't live in them. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. There is an end to this. We might not ever quite get back what we had before, but it's sort of like a saying from Rumi, the great Sufi mystic poet from the 13th century. Don't grieve. Everything you lose comes round in another form. And that God's grace moves from empty box to empty box. Recognize what you got. We've still got a lot. Amen.